Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we're going to look at a highly tactical opening known as the Scotch, and it begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then the key move pawn to d4, starting the Scotch opening. With this opening, the pieces are going to come into close contact very quickly, and so we're going to get a chance to look at all kinds of tactical details in this fascinating opening. Let's take a look. To reach the Scotch game, white begins with the move pawn to e4, immediately grabbing central space and preparing the advance of d2 to d4. To quickly mobilize his pieces and slow down white's ambitions, black selects pawn to e5 with a so-called king's pawn game. And now comes the standard move knight f3 attacking the e5 pawn, followed by knight c6, and here we've arrived at a standard position. White's aim in this position is to achieve the advance d2 to d4 under favorable circumstances. Normally, he would complete some of his kingside development either with bishop to b5, leading to the Ruy Lopez, or bishop c4, which would be known as the Italian game, and then castling kingside, and later preparing the advance of d2 to d4 by first playing c2 to c3, and then d2 to d4, so that we can always recapture with a pawn. But in the Scotch, white chooses a different strategy altogether. He immediately lashes out with the move pawn to d4, and this is the signature move of the Scotch opening. Now, there are some real advantages to playing the move pawn to d4 so early in this position. And the first advantage is that black clearly must react to the threat to the e5 pawn right away. And he doesn't really have an option to play a passive move such as pawn to d6, since this would lead to all kinds of problems. One very interesting way to exploit this move would simply be bishop to b5, adding pressure to these pawns, and this is actually a very strong move in this position. But another, more obvious approach would simply be to play pawn takes pawn on e5. And now after the move pawn takes pawn on e5, queen takes d8, black does not have the option to recapture with his knight, since he would be leaving the e5 pawn hanging, and therefore he must relinquish castling rights, leaving his king in the center, and making it more difficult to deploy his pieces and coordinate them properly in the rest of the middle game. It turns out then that black has little choice but to play pawn takes pawn on d4. And after knight takes d4, we reach the position shown here. And by playing d2 to d4 early, white has forced black to exchange his stronghold pawn in the center with that move e takes d4. And at the same time, white has gained a centralized post for his knight on d4, and has opened up some scope for the dark-squared bishop. However, black has a few reasons to be excited about this early exchange in the center. Unlike other openings such as the Ruy Lopez, black no longer has to worry about defending the e5 pawn with his life. For example, if we back up just a little bit, just before white played this move d4, the aggressive Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5, or even the quiet move bishop to c4, often bait black into spending some extra time defending this e-pawn, and often he has to play the cramping move d6 at some point, not right away, but at some point he'll often have to play this cramping move in order to hold on to that pawn on e5. But in the Scotch, after the moves d4, takes, and takes, black never again has to worry about the future of his e5 pawn, and this allows him to develop a little bit more freely. A second factor works in black's favor in this position. In the current position, white has made two moves with his knight on d4, and this little fact means that black doesn't need to worry too much about falling behind in development in the opening either. And this is a concern which black constantly needs to monitor in the other openings. So, how does black continue? Well, it turns out that he has two sensible developing moves in this position. The first of these is knight to f6, but the variation that we're going to look at today is the move bishop to c5, deploying the bishop and adding pressure to the centralized knight on d4, perhaps baiting that knight into retreating. And in fact, many white players do unwittingly play knight to b3 in this position, but after bishop b6, white no longer profits from the centralized position of the knight on d4, and white is actually a little bit behind in development in this position, as black has two pieces developed and white only has one. So it's very easy for black to play comfortably here. He'll finish up his kingside development, and then he'll either target e4 as a weakness, or he'll look to achieve the equalizing pawn break, pawn to d5. So, after this move, bishop to c5, white needs to do something more enterprising. And knight takes c6 is one strong method to continue. White's argument here is that both of black's potential recaptures have serious downsides. If black replies with d-pawn takes on c6, white once again replies with queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, leaving black with a small but significant disadvantage. White can easily castle and connect his rooks and bring his pieces to attractive locations, whereas black will struggle to harmonize his pieces. Another serious problem in positions just like these is that white will have a much easier time in the endgame, since it's easier for white to create a pass pawn with his pawn majority than it is for black on the queen side, thanks to these doubled pawns. The alternative recapture, b pawn takes c6, still leaves white with a very pleasant situation after the strong developing move bishop d3. And white will one day simply castle, complete his kingside development, and then he'll be looking to play the move pawn to f4, creating serious chances for attack, while black will be lacking any sort of real counterplan. So, the capture on c6 appears to be quite strong, but in fact, black has a sneaky third option available in this position, and that move is queen to f6. The queen evacuates the d8 square and threatens mate in 1 on f2. This buys black just enough time to capture on c6 under more ideal conditions, and if you take a close look at the position, you'll recognize that defending f2 is not such an easy task. White simply doesn't want to push the f-pawn forward, since this would turn the bishop on c5 into a monster, and it would deprive white of the option of castling kingside for quite some time. So instead, white often plays either queen d2, or he'll play the move queen f3, but both of these moves have some drawbacks. And from here, black has quite a few different ways to play. He can mangle white's structure a bit with the move queen takes f3 before capturing on c6, or he can simply capture on c6 with the d-pawn, and in this case he no longer needs to worry about the queen takes d8 exchange, displacing his king and getting rid of those castling rights. Queen takes c6 is also an option, but actually tends to be frowned upon a little bit in this position. And I do want to point out that after the d-pawn captures, it's true that this still leaves white with a bit of a structural advantage, but black should have fewer problems here getting his pieces to attractive locations, and he still has the plan of perhaps creating some counterplay against the e-pawn, since this f-pawn does not want to move in these positions. So, it's thanks to this move, queen to f6, that black is not inferior in the position after knight takes c6. Even so, plenty of players handling the black pieces are not aware of the move queen f6, and even after black has played queen f6, there is still potential for white to outplay black in an endgame which he may be more comfortable with, so this is an option for white. However, if white wants to play more ambitiously and steer the game towards tactical variations, his alternative idea is to maintain the post of the position of the knight on d4, and he normally does this with the move bishop e3, which is just as popular as the move knight takes c6. And now it turns out that once again, black's best move in this position is queen f6, but this time it's for different reasons. We're not doing this in order to threaten mate in 1. Instead, black is simply continuing to apply pressure to the knight on d4. There's another point to this move queen f6, which is that after white played the move bishop to e3, he had also set up a threat, knight takes c6, winning material immediately thanks to the exposed location of the bishop on c5. But after the move queen f6, this no longer works, since after the move knight takes c6, black can simply play bishop takes e3, and the queen is no longer sitting on d8, waiting to be captured. At this point, it's even clearer that white does not want to move the knight from that d4 location, since in this position that would expose the bishop on e3. And so white simply plays the move pawn to c3, continuing to maintain the post of that knight. And now black continues his development with the move knight g to e7. And at this moment we reach a very interesting point where black is very close to achieving this equalizing thrust that we spoke of earlier, pawn to d5. In fact, if white just continues his development without paying too much attention here, say bishop to e2 or perhaps g3, black is fully justified in playing the move pawn to d5 when most of his opening problems would be solved. So, once again, white finds himself in a situation where he needs to react very precisely if he wants to keep a serious shot at the initiative going. It turns out the recipe here for white is the move bishop to c4, which not only develops but also prevents black from achieving this ambitious thrust pawn to d5. And in fact, from here, the onus is now on black to prove that his pieces have the capacity for activity before white simply builds up the attack with this eventual move f2 to f4. It's very interesting to explore the various tries for both sides here, but theory has eventually shown for good reason that black's strongest way to continue now is the move knight to e5, pushing that bishop away. The bishop retreats now to e2, and there now follows the move queen to g6, putting pressure on both the e4 pawns and the g2 pawns. And both of these moves are very important that black plays both of these moves and is aware of these subtleties. Once again, as he often does in the Scotch, black is using the pressure against e4 as a way to slow white down, since white always wants to avoid making this move f2 to f3. That leaves that dark squared diagonal vulnerable, and it's also just taking away from our eventual aim of making that pawn move all the way to f4. At the same time, black retains the ability to break either with the moves pawn to d5 or perhaps even with the move pawn to f5 at some point, and it's these factors which fully compensate for his slight delay in development and the somewhat vulnerable position of his queen. And so we have reached a complex and interesting positions with chances for both sides. I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of some key variations of the Scotch opening. By playing the d2 to d4 thrust so early in the opening, white has succeeded at creating an immediate tactical clash which can either be played by white as a chance to reach an endgame with a positional battle lying ahead, or it can also be used in order to create tactical conditions in which both sides must meet each other precisely blow for blow in order to avoid falling behind. As white, this is an excellent opportunity to seize control over the direction of the game and to choose what kind of game will be played. Whereas with black, if you're willing to do a little bit of homework and you have a few variations prepared, you can also count on will-winning chances in the positions which lie ahead. That's it for today, and we'll see you again.